Well, hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining today's webinar. This is a recording on our series for diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, which we also fondly call DEIA with AgriSafe Network. If you are new to AgriSafe, our tagline is protecting the people who feed the world. And we're kind of expanding beyond agriculture, looking into forestry and also commercial fishing. However, the goal is to really protect the people working in these industries to provide our food, fuel, and fiber. We provide an ongoing needs assessment for ag producer needs. Also, again, the forestry and commercial fishing sector through a model we call Total Farmer Health, which is really a total worker health model. We try to train rural health professionals across the nation who are working with our ag sector industry because they have a lot of work-related risk that providers may not be aware of. We work with partnerships across our National Institutes for Occupational Safety and Health, ag centers. There are several across the nation, rural research centers, and also other nonprofit organizations. And then we try to maintain a culture of readiness and organizational expectation to protect and respond. So you'll see us responding to infectious disease threats, anything that kind of is, again, challenging our producers' health, folks working in the ag sector. You're going to see AgriSafe in that space. So that's just a brief introduction of what we do. And speaking of introductions, my name is Nisha Rose Davison. I'm the Public Health and Equity Director who helps coordinate and strategize our diversity outreach with AgriSafe Network. I am very pleased to introduce our presenter of the hour. Her name is Tyra Howell, and she's an MPH candidate at Tulane University, and she served as a health policy intern with AgriSafe Network. So Tyra Howell is from Southeastern Connecticut. She graduated with a bachelor's degree in public health with a dual minor in sociology and psychology from Drexel University in 2021. Currently, Tyra is pursuing a master's in public health with a concentration in health policy from Tulane University. At AgriSafe, her applied practicum experience is focused on the impact of health policies on total farmer health. And she also did some work cultivating diverse topics and speakers for our DEIA webinar series. So welcome, Tyra, and we look forward to your presentation.
Hello, everyone. Oh,
it's fine. That's my fault. I forgot. And then one last reminder, at the conclusion of this presentation, we appreciate your feedback for our speaker and for our series. Feel free to complete that at the completion of the series. And with that, I will end my brief remarks. And Tyra, it is all left to you.
hello, everyone. Thank you, Nisha, for the introduction. As she said before, my name is Tyra Howell, and today I'm going to be talking about Indigenous agriculture, food sovereignty, and health, and how these three things all interconnect. Hi. So before we get started, I wanted to do a quick land acknowledgement. I just thought that since we are discussing Indigenous Americans today, I would be remiss to not talk about the history of what has happened to Indigenous people on this land. So in Covington, Louisiana, where this webinar is being recorded, this land was once inhabited by the Choctaw and Alakapisa tribes. They stewarded the land for generations before the arrival of European settlers. And there have been many tribes who were in Louisiana who have been displaced, and only one remains on their original land. So just a quick terminology thing. So in this presentation, I'm going to be referring to this group as Indigenous Americans. Many people also refer to them as Native Americans. This is basically anyone whose ancestry traces back to the inhabitants of what is now the United States prior to the 15th century before Christopher Columbus. Due to my research, this is the term that I have come to the conclusion is the most appropriate to use. And this also includes Alaska Natives. A lot of research that talks about this group also groups them into Alaska Natives. Most of the research that we're talking about today doesn't really talk a lot about Alaska, but that's just something to note. Okay, so the table of contents. First, we're going to talk about the history of Indigenous Americans and agriculture. And then we're going to talk about colonization and how this led to the loss of farmlands for Indigenous Americans. We're going to talk about the current state of Indigenous agriculture, and then we're going to talk about food sovereignty, and that will lead us right into our conclusion. Okay, so the history of Indigenous Americans and agriculture. So, before Christopher Columbus's voyage to America, Indigenous people were growing a large variety of food. They fished, they hunted, and they also participated in agriculture as well, and they grew fruits, vegetables, and grains. So a lot of the sustainable farming and land stewardship techniques that we use today have roots in Indigenous agriculture. And for many Indigenous Americans at the time, agriculture wasn't just about survival, but it was also a way to connect with nature on a spiritual level. So these are some crops that were introduced to the Americans basically through Indigenous people. We have maize, or better known as corn, squash, beans, tomatoes, peppers, all of these things, which are major parts of our food system today. And something that I think is important to note is that Indigenous Americans, after European settlers arrived, taught the Europeans how to grow these foods and how to make their crops prosper. So without Indigenous Americans, we probably wouldn't have been able to perhaps survive on this land, many of our ancestors, and a lot of us probably wouldn't be here. So one of the major Indigenous contributions to agriculture is the Three Sisters agriculture technique. It's basically a form of companion farming. The Three Sisters agriculture technique includes growing maize, squash, and beans together. And basically these plants they have a mutually beneficial relationship, and they all help each other to thrive. Which basically this was the start of companion farming, which is something that many farmers still use today in order to help boost their profits. Agroforestry is also companion farming, but this also involves trees and not just crops. And then another thing is regenerative agriculture, which is just farming with nature and conservation in mind. This is something that is coming up a lot more in conversation around agriculture recently, just because agriculture is something that is very intense on the environment. So many people are starting to look back at old techniques that Indigenous Americans used to use to see how we can improve the relationship between agriculture and the planet. Okay, and now we are going to discuss colonization and the loss of Indigenous land. Okay, so before we start talking about the specific policies, I wanted to point out this map. On top, we have the Indigenous land before colonization. So the orange is where Indigenous people were, and the gray is parts that weren't that were not occupied. So as you can see, the vast majority of the continental United States is completely covered. This was land where Indigenous Americans were thriving, they were farming, they were living. But now, present day, if you look on the bottom half of your screen, you can see that there is not nearly as much land. Just a lot of Oklahoma is covered, but for the most part, there is not much land that's covered. This is more than like 90% of the land that Indigenous people have lost due to colonization. So now we're going to talk about some specific policies that have robbed Indigenous land. So the first would be the Indian Removal Act of 1830. This removed many Indigenous Americans from the quality farmland that they lived on, and it put them onto land that was a lot less fertile. So they weren't able to use some of the techniques they'd used before. In 1876, we have the Homestead Act. This transferred 270 million acres of Indigenous land, to white settlers. And through these acts, Indigenous Americans lost nearly 99% of their land. The Dawes Act of 1887 broke up Indigenous land into small allotments, which broke up a lot of the social cohesion that we see in tribes. So now I want to discuss quickly how food control is basically a major tool of colonization, specifically with this group. So when Indigenous Americans were forced onto reservations, they were barred from farming anything more than like small gardens. And they also were forced to practice European monoculture farming techniques, which is basically they were only allowed to grow one crop rather than use techniques like the Three Sisters agriculture. The US government in the 19th century sanctioned the murder of millions of buffalo in order to starve Indigenous people when they were fighting back against land removal and colonization efforts. So obviously, if you control people and they can't eat, then they can't fight back. And when Indigenous children were sent to residential schools, they weren't taught about a lot of the Indigenous agriculture techniques, which led to the near demise of the Three Sister agriculture techniques in the 1930s. Okay, so now we're going to discuss the current state of Indigenous agriculture. So today, the majority of Indigenous Americans live in urban areas away from reservations and farmland. And even though Indigenous Americans help shape the agriculture system the way we see it today, they make up only about 2.3% of the nation's farmers. This is a little less than 80,000 producers, 59 million acres of farmland, which is about 6% of the country's farmland, and $3.5 billion of sales. Indigenous farmers are typically younger than white farmers, and they're also more likely to be female. Yes, and 75% of Indigenous farmers specialize in livestock, and of that, 42% work with cattle or are dairy farmers. Okay, so if we look at this map, this shows the concentration of Indigenous farmers in the US. So the areas where they're darker, specifically like the green, that is where the vast majority of Indigenous farmers today live. As you can see, there's a decent amount clustered in Oklahoma and some in Alaska, and then around that Four Corners region with Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah right there. There's a decent amount there as well. Okay, so now I wanted to discuss some issues that are kind of unique to Indigenous farmers. So Indigenous injury rates among Indigenous farmers, particularly youth, are higher than the general agriculture population. So if we look at the injury rates among Indigenous farmers, the injury rate is about 24 per 1,000 farmers, whereas for other minority farms, it is 1.8 per 1,000. Okay. And a lot of this can be attributed to the large amounts of livestock farming in Indigenous agriculture. This is associated with an increased risk of injury due to either like the animals being dangerous or the type of equipment that they have to use. Modern indigenous farmland is more vulnerable to extreme heat and lack of precipitation, which, as we know, is incredibly dangerous and can lead to loss of money for farmers. If we go back to the map, we can see that this is areas, particularly like over here in Arizona, it's an area that we know to be incredibly dry and which can be dangerous to livestock and crops. And indigenous farmers are also more likely to lack the internet, which can be incredibly harmful to business. Those areas of the country that we were just looking at also are more likely to lack access to internet. Something to keep in mind. I also wanted to touch on healthcare access for this population. So members of federally recognized tribes are eligible for the Indian Health Service, which is a federally subsidized healthcare program, which to many people, federally subsidized healthcare sounds like it could be very beneficial, very important for one's health, but the Indian Health Service is notoriously underfunded. Every year when the budget increases, it doesn't account for the high medical inflation increase, which is one of the many reasons that it doesn't have enough money to fund all the services that this population needs. So in 2017, the per capita spending for IHS patient health services was about less than half of the average nationwide spending on healthcare. So basically, if you take what is spent on a non-Indigenous American, the government spends about twice as much on them versus an Indigenous American. The IHS also doesn't include specialist services. So like if you were pregnant and you had to see an obstetrician, or if you needed to see a nephrologist, you wouldn't be able to do that with the IHS. You would have to do that elsewhere. Due to the lack of funding, doctors working in the IHS make less than the nationwide average, which leads to high turnover rates. Obviously, most doctors care about their patients, but also money is a big factor. And if they can make more elsewhere, they're pretty likely to leave. This year, President Biden increased the annual budget for the IHS by $2 billion for the next 5 fiscal years, which could potentially increase some of these disparities that we see, but there isn't any research to suggest if this has made a tremendous change or not, since it was so recent. Okay. So now I wanted to touch on food insecurity in Indigenous communities and historical determinants of that. So for anybody who doesn't know, food insecurity is essentially a lack of consistent access to enough healthy food for every person in a household to live an active, healthy lifestyle. So about 1 in 4 Indigenous people deal with food insecurity. Tribes are sovereign, which means they have the ability to govern themselves. Reservations restrict the ability to gather and grow food the way that they did before reservation, before colonization. Many treaties between the US and tribes stipulate that the US provides food rations, but the focus on these rations is often more on just preventing starvation rather than creating nutritious meals, which is an issue. Which leads to many health issues. So a lot of the major health issues that we see in Indigenous Americans are connected to a lack of access to healthy food. A lot of times when we think about malnourished, we think about people who can barely eat, but a lot of times what's more likely to happen to somebody in America is that they may have enough access. They may have enough food, but the food that they're getting isn't quality. It's not nutritious. So before the 1940s, diabetes was incredibly rare among Indigenous Americans. Like the Navajo, for instance, in their language didn't even have a word for diabetes before this time because it wasn't something that they saw. So the rise of food rations from the US government led to a steep increase in diabetes among Indigenous people. So today, we can see that nearly 50% of Indigenous Americans have obesity. Nearly a quarter, 23.5% have diabetes, which is the highest of any racial group, and 33.5% have hypertension. And now we're going to discuss food sovereignty. So food sovereignty, for people who aren't aware, is the ability of a community to control its own food sources, ensuring their access to healthy food. It's also important for food sovereignty that this food is relevant to cultures, because as we discussed before, food, farming, these are all things that are connected, that are more than food to this community. And food is more than just a meal for nearly all of us. Access to nutritious food is essential for living a healthy life. We all know this. Food sovereignty helps Indigenous people also reconnect with their roots and the activities that their ancestors were able to do. And for those living on reservations now, fruits and vegetables can be up to 40% higher than they are in other parts of the country, but less nutritious food is often cheaper than other parts of the country. And since there is a high poverty rate in this population, that essentially leads to many of them not being able to make healthy food choices that they may want to make. But if you can't afford it and it's kind of being suggested to you, that's how you're going to eat. So now I wanted to show a quick YouTube video talking about this topic more.
Tonight, many of us are preparing for that big traditional Thanksgiving meal, and holiday gatherings are back in a big way as pandemic restrictions continue to ease. But for a growing number of families, it's still very, very tough. And the 2020 census found that over 37 million Americans live in poverty, and local food banks are inundated. Feeding America reports 1 in 9 Americans face food insecurity. Hunger impacts every community, but Native Americans are more likely to face this problem. 1 in 4 Indigenous people experience food insecurity. And our lead race and culture reporter, Candace Red, she has the story.
Reconnecting our youth with the Earth Mother.
As a Native American, Alfred Melbourne is pushing the food sovereignty movement.
Growing food in a traditional and culturally appropriate way that's regenerative and sustainable. Growing with Mother Nature and not against it.
Melbourne founded Three Sisters Gardens in 2018 to teach at-risk youth how to grow, harvest, and distribute organic vegetables. The goal, end hunger.
Three Sisters Gardens, located right here in West Sacramento, from the railroad tracks to the river, is designated a food desert. Our goal is to give away from 40 up to 60% of our food here locally. Definitely trying to work with the Native and Indigenous communities.
Nationally, 1 in 5 Native Americans face hunger. That's more than 3 times the rate of white people.
We're not just trying to give food away, we're also trying to teach folks how to grow their own food so that they can do for themselves.
When you're talking about food sovereignty, I would say that this is specifically tied to, for example, gardening.
As a Native American educator, Dr. Rose Souza War Soldier says food sovereignty is also about culture restoration for Indigenous people.
The idea of food sovereignty, really is the idea of having a land-based return to cultural practices and cultural revival. And so this is deeply tied to land, which means that it's deeply tied to culture.
All we have to do is remember what's innate and in our DNA. And so we have to use our voice to continue to advocate for other Native and Indigenous people so that we can get back to doing for ourselves as we did in the past.
And there is a way that you can help all this month.
Thank you. go back into full screen. So now after that, obviously that video showed one person's efforts, one organization's effort to combat this issue. So I wanted to highlight some more organizations that are supporting Indigenous farmers in a variety of ways. So one, we have the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative. This provides policy research and legal analysis for Indigenous producers that helps them build up their local food economies that we kind of like we saw in the video, and also support the mission of food sovereignty. We have the Native American Agriculture Fund, which provides grants for Indigenous farmers and ranchers. And we also have the Indigenous Farmer Hub. This is basically a network of Indigenous farmers and agriculture workers that helps provide community for them, and also provides access to nutritious foods and helps people to reconnect with historical agriculture methods. We have Soul Fire Farm, which is one I would extra recommend. They have a lot of resources on their website for anybody who wants to learn more. They are an Afro-Indigenous centered community farm, and they grow and distribute food to impoverished communities, and they are working to fight for food sovereignty as well. These are just obviously a couple of examples. There are so many other amazing organizations you could look towards if you are curious about this issue. Okay. And that is all I have. So thank you so much.